In discussing sin and temptation, the famous novelist and playwright Oscar Wilde once wrote that I can resist everything except temptation. In today's episode of Made for Glory, we're going to talk about the original temptation and how that continues to affect us today. In the first two chapters of the book of Genesis, we hear of the goodness of creation, that everything God makes, he says it is good. And when he creates humanity, he says it is very good. That Adam and Eve, male and female, are created good, and they are created to be with and for each other. That their bodies make sense in light of the other, as they are made in God's image and likeness. But then in chapter 3 of Genesis, that's when the bad news enters in. Sin and temptation and what we call the fall of humanity, which leads to the brokenness of the world that we live in now. And it's interesting that the temptation that's brought, first of all, to Eve by the snake, or the fallen angel, Lucifer, the devil, all the titles that we have for him, he brings it to her not as just go away from God, but he brings it to her as casting a doubt. His first words, Satan's first words to Eve are, did God really say that you can't eat from the fruit of any of the trees in the garden? Which of course is not the truth. But once Eve begins to engage with that lie, she begins to doubt this relationship. And that's always what temptation fundamentally does. It causes us to doubt the goodness of this relationship that we're called to have with God. And through that affects our relationship with ourselves and with other people. And we see this because immediately, once Eve eats the fruit, then she gives some to Adam, who is with her, by the way. A lot of times people blame Eve, but Adam is there the whole time, and he is saying nothing, and he is doing nothing. And once they do that, once they turn away from God's command, they turn away from that relationship of love that God has for them, when they, instead of receiving what God desires to give them, they grasp at it, then it says their eyes are open, but not open in a positive way, but in a way when they look at one another, no longer with purity, no longer seeing the other person with integrity, with love even, but they now see one another with lust. And once they do that, they're ashamed. So shame has entered into the picture. So it's so important for us to recognize when we talk about sin and temptation, what we're talking about fundamentally is something that separates us from a relationship of love, because that's what God desires to have with us. And that's really what Jesus desires to do. When we talk about the redemption, what does Jesus do? Is he enters into the brokenness of this world that is affected by sin, affected by the fall, and he brings restoration, that he restores us into a relationship of knowing that God is our Father who loves us, that God is our Father who loves us and desires to give us every good thing. And it's in and through that redemption, in and through that relationship, that we recognize our own dignity and the fact that we are made by God for glory.